Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Insight Live, the IT Experts Take. I'm Jason Rader, Insight's Chief Information Security Officer and the host of today's show. With me, we've got two rock stars that are going to help us through our topic, which today is Considerations for Innovation, Renewal, Readiness, and Infrastructure Strategy. We've got Carm Tagliente, our Chief Data Officer and Distinguished Engineer, and we've got Tom Hearn, our VP of Architecture. Welcome, gentlemen.
Thank you. That was a mouthful. Holy cow.
Sure was.
We're talking about a lot today. Yeah.
So I think, as we were having a lot of fun in the green room talking about a lot of different things around this topic, but the renewal aspect that's in the title that, some folks are tuning in related to that aspect, that renewal readiness related to infrastructure strategy. First of all, should we kind of talk about kind of the problem at hand, maybe like tech debt, renewal kind of things kind of piling up? Who wants to kind of tackle that first?
Well, I'll go first, Tom, if you don't mind. And then of course, I'm going to talk about AI as it relates to this, but the disruption that happened about a year ago, a little more, clearly changed the way that we think about renewal. So normally, we'd go through normal aging of our hardware infrastructure and capacity, and we would think about, well, let's buy the latest modern infrastructure to support our computing needs. AI kind of sort of threw a monkey wrench into that works because all of a sudden now we were looking more at high performance computing kinds of models and inferencing and training of data, which required GPUs, at least for the current flavor of the day, in order to be able to support these kinds of workloads. And so now all of a sudden, as we think about adoption, we're looking at not just sort of creating this capacity in your data center, but also the cloud, of course, number one. And then another one, which is really prevalent now, is the desktop. So eventually we'll be seeing these kinds of, NPUs or neural processing units also running on the desktop in order to run models and inferencing directly on your desktop. So I think it's going to hit everywhere, which will be really interesting. And it's kind of crazy when you think about it. And it's probably going to be costly eventually, but it's certainly going to be hugely productive.
So I'll add a little bit to that, and I rewind us to 4 or 5 years ago. We started seeing cloud migrations at scale. We started seeing application modernization at scale for kind of the refresh. Now that we're out of an in-tier infrastructure, moving into microservices, and we've seen this sine wave in the industry for a long time now, where since cloud's been around, where everything's going to go to cloud. And then we see costs because we didn't change operating model around cloud, making sure that we're optimizing costs from a FinOps perspective and how teams operate around that. And then we'd see a repatriation of workloads from cloud back into data center based on cost. Typically with that transition, you would see a transition in, executive leadership at our customers, senior leadership from a technical perspective. So 3-4 years ago, we got to a point where we can really start to look at optimizing our overall spend in a CapEx versus OpEx model and the ability to reset renewal structures. So typically our customers would be in a 3 to 5 year renewal cycle, very, very large spend in 1 year when they would hit that 3 or 5 year cycle. And then you'd have incremental growth over time in their purchasing cycles. That shifted heavily when you can now bring in an as a service model to give them true mobility between, do we want to do cloud to align those terms with a CapEx versus OpEx model? And do we want to do workloads? Fast forward to, about a year ago, and we're in a model that data center isn't dying necessarily. We're actually seeing an increase in data center spend significantly in certain areas. But I would say the data center is distributing is probably the right way to think about it. That as we have higher volume, higher bandwidth, higher throughput, higher speed requirements in general for processing AI ML workloads, through processing data sets closer to customer experience, manufacturing experience, retail, healthcare, et cetera, we're seeing those workloads distribute closer to the customer from an edge perspective. So what would have traditionally been put in cloud or in data center has now really expanded into true edge platforms, much higher capacity in an individual device, and an ability to distribute that workload processing much more effectively. All of those play into a broader renewal structure that requires a cost model that can adapt with that. And those 3 steps and what we've seen over the last 10 years have kind of led us to where we are. My 2 cents.
That was more like a dime, I think,
Yeah.
Tom.
No, there's a lot to.
Exactly.
I mean, I think that was a giant, perfect summary of kind of where we are. I think it's great you kind of use the comparison from a cloud perspective, because that was kind of the infrastructure shift back then. Do I need, am I going to start leveraging infrastructure as a service? What am I going to do? Am I going to push this stuff here? Where do I need to store this data to get the most effect? That whole data gravity conversation that we have quite a bit. Do I have the right speed to be able to support this cloud, paradigm that I'm using? And that definitely affected a lot of CapEx and OpEx, decisions back then. And when you were saying that, it just made me think I think, with Carm's introduction to the whole AI strategy, there's a technique and a whole strategy. Again, you're not going to accidentally land upon this. Oh, sure. I'm glad I upgraded that without having that, foresight to think about it. And just from a realities perspective, we were talking in the green room before we started, not everybody can just go out and just, hey, let's write a check, get all the latest stuff because we want to start doing AI. We're looking at renewal cycles. We're looking at licensing and agreements that we've got with, that people who sit in positions in organizations, they can't just, dive into a new contract until these old ones are up. I think now's a good time to start thinking about all of those things kind of coming together. And I think you mentioned also people weren't necessarily adjusting appropriately to that cloud consumption model and kind of got a little burnt on it. So there's a lot of lessons of the past that we kind of are happening upon right now with the enticements of what the future holds from an AI perspective. Pretty exciting topic.
Yeah, I think the one thing I'll just to add to both of your commentary, as we think about, Tom was talking about point of presence, you were talking about data gravity, but I think the distributed workload concept that Tom was hitting on, I think is really important, because infrastructure isn't just about hardware. Infrastructure is about, how do we manage our workload? And so we've seen lots of advances as it relates to not just containerization, but I'll call it more an orchestration. So with things like Kubernetes, for example, as being sort of a primary orchestration framework, it allows us to eliminate or helps us to eliminate the tech debt that you had brought up earlier, Jason, which I think is really critical, because removing tech debt as it relates to maybe the AI workload, or it doesn't really have to be AI, but probably will be, but it at least allows us to be able to sort of hit on a number of different areas, like as we're going through the cycle and we're renewing, how do we rebuild our software stack, which is part of our infrastructure, and the hardware stacks in order to be able to support it, but also create operational efficiencies as you relate to that. So you might think about that spend, and we were kind of joking earlier about, how important is ROI, but when you can hit ROI in a number of different areas, like for example, I'm eliminating tech debt, I'm able to distribute my workload to the point of presence or to the data gravity, so to make my processing more efficient, or my experience better. It's like, wow, that's super helpful in terms of just being able to address all the needs that you might have within the organization. And that too is infrastructure. And so that's a key point of investment, I think, as we think about the future.
So when I talk to customers about, renewal cycles, tech debt in general, I still go back to the, like the iron triangle of project management. So you've got cost, you've got scope, and you've got time, and take it out of the triangle context and put it on a seesaw. So, a balance, if you will. And we tend to see with our customers that when you have really high speed requirements, move that way to the left on one side. I think it's the opposite in my camera. Move it way to the right on the other side. Your two offsetting components of that. When that gets skewed and that seesaw starts flipping one way or the other, is really where we see cost to the customer, whether that's operational cost, that's technical debt, that's challenges of complexity of an environment. And the talk track that I go through with customers is, ignore where you are today. If let's say mergers and acquisitions, you have a whole bunch of renewal requirements from different technologies. Now you're in the concept of, we have a single domain requirement with multiple partners and or multiple solutions included in that. There is a cost to the organization to manage that. But however you look at it, cloud, on-prem data centers, edge platforms, et cetera. How do you take that and actually define, here are our requirements, our principles of architecture as an organization, that we have an application that is monitoring patient data, for example. This is our desired outcome of an overall guiding principles for what are required for us to operate that. And depending on the platform it's going to land on, you'll have slight variations in a reference design for that. But you're looking at the consistency between managing those environments. And we just see customers regularly getting stuck in a space that they can't get away from those. There's always that one last code base that someone, 24 years ago wrote, and it's critical to the business and they're terrified to touch it. Those are usually the applications that explode your technical cost. Look at that from an infrastructure perspective. Your core platforms that are managing network and security, no one wants to touch it because there's all these routes and rule sets and challenges that you have no idea what changing that actually breaks. Resetting and looking through the strategy of how you apply, here is our future design. And if it takes us 5 years to get into that design, that's okay. You will have an increase in cost savings over time through your renewal strategies, or you can speed that up back to the seesaw and say, we want to move this faster, but it's going to be a higher cost to migrate our current platforms into a new solution. So I really I talk about that with our customers on a regular basis. And when I get to draw it on a whiteboard, very handsy on this call as always, but I'm sitting here drawing these circles and walking them through, and we can take an example of what's your easiest application to do that and what's your hardest application to do that. And the truth of where we need to land is somewhere in between. And then you reverse that into your cost structure.
So one thing, just to add to that just a little bit, because I know when we talk about sort of the approach, in the triangle, I love that metaphor. One thing that I think we want to also take into consideration is like when we think about infrastructure is it's not just additive. Like I think we always think about, and when I teach my students about scalability, it's not just one-way scalability, it's elasticity. It's like, how do you become more efficient? So you scale up, you scale down. So I think when we think about infrastructure strategy, it's not just like keep adding more capacity. And, from a data perspective, I think we always just think about add more storage. But I think life cycle is really critical. So when I talk to customers, invariably, especially related to AI, it's about what is the life cycle of your data? Like, do you keep it forever? Is it viable forever? Like, what are the regulations, for example, that are required in order to keep it? But most people keep data around forever. And if you've ever seen the cool iceberg diagram, it basically shows, your data above the water is what you're working with, but you've got all this data under the water, which is dark data. And we just keep adding more storage and infrastructure to collect it. And it's like, well, at some point we have to think about how do we really strategically look at it and say, yes, I may want to keep it, and I may need more data density to collect that data, store it, use it, access it, or maybe I just rethink the way that I use my data. So how do I curate it in the most appropriate way? I think it's another important part of the conversation. It's not just about sort of add, or use the latest modern technology because I can store more in a lower footprint, or I get a faster processor. Because not everything is HPC, not everything is storing data, et cetera, et cetera. You get the idea. But that's a really important conversation for probably any C-level executive within the organization, is just instead of the continuous buy more to support more, it's more of the let's rethink our strategy, kind of the best practices, principled design, Tom, that you were mentioning. How do I kind of go back to that and say, well, this is a principled architectural approach, let's apply it.
I think what you just said makes perfect sense. It's kind of the way that a lot of people think. And by the way, that whole add more storage was the right answer for a lot of time. That was the right answer. More bandwidth, more storage, more compute. But I think that as we have new capabilities that we're adding to an organization, like AI, like, the big intro, a lot of people do think, well, I've got to add a bunch of new stuff. And it's easy to do that and get the results that you want. Well, it's expensive. Back to Tom's triangle. It's easy to do that and get some results quickly and ignore the dark data, all the other stuff, until it comes to a point where you're like, wow, we really should figure that out. Because that's a lot of tech debt overall in an organization that they've got to figure out the processes, the data, all of that guy left 5 years ago, don't touch his workstation because last time we turned it off, everything broke. Those kinds of things that happen. That's a big effort. And, from a security perspective, from just about any time you think about it, all of that effort just to get it known is a lot of sweat and treasure that it takes to get there. And there's no perceived benefit until you actually do something after that. You know what I'm saying? So that's a hard sell. But I think finding an adjacency, which, to that AI point, AI usually is kind of additive to a lot of things that are going on. Right now in our organization, we're doing things like a new CRM, we're looking at new ERP and different things like that. Those are great times to take this whole thing into consideration on where you want to be, looking at your master data model, how all that stuff comes together. And by the way, doing all those at the same time is a gigantic lift, but we're undertaking it because we know we have good vision of where we want to be, and it's going to take all of these things to be able to get there. So, but it's hard to just sell it for the sake of doing it, but adding it as a component to this big transformation is something that we see.
Right.
Yeah, we see. So on the concept of, I don't want to say wasted data, but just buy more stuff to store more stuff, that we're actually seeing more and more in the compute space. So think memory and compute. We have denser processors, we have higher memory capacities. When you start getting into heavy mathematical calculations, those are very, very important and extremely costly. So there's two items I talk through on a regular basis that we run across these scenarios. One is we hear all the time, we're cloud native everywhere, the data center's dead. Some valid, relevant points in there in certain cases. But when we dig into what our customers are actually doing, they're usually moving to containers. There's some, function as a services play in that space, but largely they're changing the compute. Think of the paradigm of the compute model. So if you really look at a container actually does not behave that differently than a VM. The data structures, how you store, they can or cannot behave the same depending on how you look at it. But we are looking at a reduction in the required overhead to run a core function. So in a container, you're running, a code base that's doing a function or a subset of functions. And in that model, that moves us away from the world that we used to have, a 74 billion core VM with, 784 gigs of RAM, because our only way to scale was doing that. And interestingly enough, when we do actually cloud migrations from a data center and repatriations back from the cloud to the data center, we tend to see about a 35% reduction in required compute resources as a result of the team looking at that and saying, hey, we're over allocated here. Hey, we didn't have a manageable chunk before. That's really, really critical when you're looking at a renewal strategy. And this is a very, very common discussion with many customers right now based on, I'll say, some mergers going on in our industry. This is a very relevant topic that it absolutely impacts your renewal strategy based on how you're looking at scaling your architecture, not just your compute or your storage. How do you respond to demand? And the term elasticity was used earlier. That's also how do you reduce your compute requirements. Most of our customers just tend to grow at peak and they run at peak. So you go back to that 35% number, all of a sudden the spend that you're using on renewal cycles, on cloud purchasing cycles, on application development cycles, that cost can be offset if you manage that more effectively. So it's not just an accretive thing. It can be decretive to cost on the right way, particularly over a longer period of time where you're driving towards that reference architecture.
And it's a really important point. I mean, I think the efficiencies that we gain from advances or innovation in capabilities that we have available to us from an application development perspective, or call it even a virtualization perspective, because at the end of the day, even when we're looking at containers, they're virtualized at the operating system layer versus virtualization at the VM layer. So that's the real big difference. So they're lighter weight, of course, but it also encourages, like you said, decoupled architectures, which by their very nature are going to be more efficient in terms of processing, and easier to maintain, by the way. But I'll add in the word sustainable, because now all of a sudden, and it's not so much, and maybe it is about reducing our compute cost, but I think it's to use them more efficiently, because I think sustainability isn't necessarily only about reducing cost or power consumption. I think it's about using it more efficiently, and I think that's the important part. So that is the one key area, I think, as you were saying, Tom. I mean, and I 100% agree with you. It's like when you're doing that migration and you're rationalizing your workloads and you're looking at the existing tech debt and you're moving into the cloud or whatever, maybe it's back to the data center. How do you create that kind of efficient environment by using the latest technologies, or at least the advances that we have today, to be able to do that, through virtualization or other techniques? And there are certain virtualization techniques you probably don't want to use any longer, but in general, there are other ways to virtualize your workloads.
100%.
Shifting gears ever so slightly, as you kind of talked about the journey earlier, Tom, from cloud, and now we're talking AI, it made me think, there was a pretty heavy competency lift that we kind of asked of our infrastructure people to go from on-prem to cloud. I mean, and that's still in effect. I mean, there's still, that journey is going on for folks. And, I just thought, as Carm kind of did his intro talking about the AI angle, I think there's another level of lift that's got to go on from to understand how AI comes into this whole thing. Are you running into that a lot? Because that's certainly your ability to support, architect, design, and support your infrastructure is part of a strategy.
For sure. So, I look back in the industry, particularly 7-8 years ago, when most cloud structures were still largely operating as, there were native services that were cloud consumed, but it's an API that's really operating a model behind the scene that's running a white box hypervisor and some level of network management, et cetera. So your concepts of, when you boil cloud down to what it really is, it's still a data center, despite the fact we would love to believe it's something magical, et cetera. The cloud providers have done a tremendous job of efficient operationalizing, that's the word I'm trying to say, from a management perspective across those platforms. So where we're not utilizing that efficiency, we don't tend to see a cheaper cost or a more efficient run rate. That's what I mean when I say you have to change how you operate in that model. For example, your development and test environments, they should not be running 24 hours a day like they are in an on-prem data center. There's a significant added cost of doing so. So thinking of it from that direction, we were able to bring a lot of, I'll say, traditional teammates that had significant data center background. Okay, when you talk about it that way, it's different. In the AI ML space, we have a lot of teammates that work in the infrastructure, the cloud side, that move into that AI ML space, and it's described as this magical thing that's so fancy. And I'm way undershooting the importance and the difficulty of effectively running AI ML platforms. But when you really think about what is it doing, this is not a new capability. We just have a denser, more efficient level of processor that can do the calculations at a speed that is relevant to a human to function. So it's matrix algebra is really what it is. It's just a tremendous amount of dimensional calculations. It's the distance between vectors, et cetera, for any of the math nerds out there. But the complexity around operationalizing the data, how you integrate that, how you validate it's valid data that you're getting versus just seeing a math calculation, that is the really hard part that we see our customers struggle with. And they get stuck around the concept of, it's this new thing when it's just a different model of operationalizing how we've worked the last 30 years. I give the same comparison, when we hear containerization now. Containerization is essentially a mainframe in a much more efficient way. It's kernel isolation. It's C groups for any of the Unix nerds out there that's back into the 70s and 80s. Those concepts are not new. They were just made more operationally efficient and effective and manageable. And I see the same concept driving over time with AI ML. You add in the complexity of the number of startups and ISVs, et cetera. It just gets overwhelming, which is why I'm tremendously happy we have people like Carm here.
Thanks, Tom.
Well, that's a great point, because I consistently have talked to folks who say maybe the infrastructure people at an organization kind of feel left out of the game a little bit. But what you just said makes perfect sense. Those guys know how to do this. They just got to, it's the thing they've always done. They've just got to be engaged, and they can have a lot to
and in a slightly different way.
Yeah.
And I just want to pull on that string just a little bit. So the thing that you said, Tom, I think that's really relevant. And Jason, you reaffirmed it. But it's really just, where is the easy button in all of this? So the cloud is easy, right? So shared responsibility model. And Tom, you're 100% right. It's like, it just, shared responsibility model just means that the data center is managed by the cloud provider, and then we just use it. So that's great. Now, if we do it ourselves in the data center, then we need to know this is how we put everything together in order to be able to make it an easy button. Well, we're doing exactly that right now. So we're building out AI infrastructure with our partners to be able to say, hey, how do we create this, containerized, Kubernetes-based cluster environment where we can run our AI workloads, and how do we determine what hardware, software, and versions of CUDA or whatever we might want are installed in order to be able to do this. And our teams that have been doing this for years and years and years are helping us to automate this so that we can just not walk in, but kind of press an easy button, by using, Ansible or Terraform or whatever the automation mechanism is, spin up the environment, hook up the network, and voila, you're up and running in your AI environment. And it's, maybe a little more complicated than that, but in general, that's what we're doing. And it's taking advantage of all those skills, Tom, that you're talking about. But we're just abstracting them to make them easier for the customer, because, you're right. There aren't many ML people that really do know anything about, the Linux operating system or, the underpinnings of Unix. And I think that's key to what this is all about. And that's where success will be, I think, at the end of the day. It's really just sort of making this easy. Because as you said, especially with Edge, for example, or point of presence, we are moving back out into the field. We're not just saying everything's the cloud. The cloud's not going to be the center of the world. So it is a distributed architecture. It's a distributed hybrid environment forever. Not forever, but for a long period of time. Wow, I just said forever. That's kind of crazy. I should take that back. But in general, you get the idea. It's a sine wave, actually. It goes back and forth. But when you said mainframe, I cringed. I was like, what? Mainframe? But anyways, I think that's really an important part, is that you can make it easy. You can work with hardware providers to create these call them validated architectures, and then deploy them simply.
And I think back to that whole renewal thing that we started off with, the as a service model that you can acquire this is a big, easy button too, because that's not, a lot of people, that's abstract to them because they're used to acquiring things the way that they did. But like an organization like Insight, we can come in and take the hardware, the whole solution, and it can be acquired as a service that you can flex up. And
that's how you break this cycle. You break this cycle of, we're stuck in this 3 to 5 year renewal. Yep. And the challenge a lot of customers had in the past when they wanted to move to cloud was, that's great, but I'm still on a renewal cycle and need to run on this infrastructure during that time. So if I have 3 more years and I'm starting migration to cloud, now all of a sudden I'm double paying on our cost to IT, or the cost of the business, or wherever they allocated that to. And Carm, you said something on the, moving to the edge. I mean, we were actually talking about this in the green room before we got on the call, that, when you hear the concept of data centers dead, it's not. It's either in the cloud, it's distributed to the edge. In some cases, we're seeing a significant increase in spend because of AI ML workloads and data privacy and challenges of migration, et cetera. And that's completely up to the overall team's view of what is their concern of CapEx versus OpEx, what's their risk they're willing to take, and us helping our customers solve that challenge of the equation to get their triangle, or in my case, the seesaw that we put on its side, balanced in a way that works for the business and angles one direction so they can continue to grow and accelerate as part of that process.
Yeah. One last thing, plug, we're kind of getting close to time here, but as I've been, we have lots of partners, vendors that come to us to show us their roadmaps, talk to us about new things that are being included in their platforms. And one of the things that's got me excited, a lot of platforms are building in more security elements into the infrastructure, which is a big deal. Again, now it's not a bolted on or added on piece of gear. It's part of the system and part of the iOS that runs on those. So that's pretty exciting too.
Very, very exciting. We may live a little bit in the security space, Jason, and the complexity and challenges of, particularly with tech debt. Tech debt also increases security risk significantly in many cases, where you have 2 platforms doing the same function. All of a sudden, your risk just went through the roof, and we see that regularly.
Yeah, I think the those calm prescribed frameworks as it relates to security is also going to be an important part. So if we use common disciplined approaches and we're we focus on the optimization and the framework strategy, then security becomes easier because we're following a known pattern versus you're just using whatever approach that you want. So like, some people are doing remote procedure calls, other people are using HTTP communications mechanisms, and it's like, it's all over the board. And so instead of, sort of looking at what are the different network communications protocols that we're using, or where is the data being stored, a good infrastructure approach allows you to understand where are your data assets, where are your compute assets, and then how do you protect them? Because if you can't identify them and classify them, you can't protect them. And I think it starts with the infrastructure strategy. I mean, at the end of the day.
Awesome. Well, hello, puppy, whoever's barking there.
Sorry.
But I think that's probably a good place to stop. It's been an exciting conversation considering how it started off. We weren't really sure where we were going to go with this, but I think it was a pretty good overview of all of the things, the components that folks need to think about, how you align it with the renewal cycles, how you can get to that new thing, the way you can acquire it, the way that your infrastructure org, your folks can be involved in the overall process along with the AI folks. It's a good story. Any parting words for folks? I know, Carm, you've always got some stuff you want to drop on people. Tom, you as well. We'll start with Carm.
Well, I mean, all I would say is that embrace it, because it's, we are in the era of disruption with AI. And I think in a lot of ways, the techniques that we've been talking about, like Tom said, they're not new, but we now have the opportunity to really apply them. And I think this disruption allows us to rethink our approach. And so now's a good time to actually go forward with it.
And I would just say, don't underestimate organizational culture as you're going down this path. Be realistic on where you can be, how your company tends to spend and operate overall, and figure out who you work with on a strategy to make sure that you're working through that process and you have your long-term roadmap of where you're in 3 to 5 years as an organization. And thanks for having us, Jason.
Yes, thank you.
Nice to have you guys. It's always a pleasure. I love it too. I mean, you just brought up one last point. There's chief digital and chief data officers in organizations now. Those folks care about the infrastructure as well. So having the CIO, the CTO, the CDO, and the CDO, I guess we need to distinguish those. All those guys get together to deal with the infrastructure strategy, because it's important to all of them. So I think it's kind of where some of these things used to be done, kind of compartmentalized. You get what you get. It's so much more, when we talk strategy, and that's a culture shift to a big degree in a lot of organizations. But I think as people that come in all the time and do this for folks, that's one of those things we recommend from an insight perspective is, hey, this is a strategy. It's got to include everybody, because that's the way that we're going to succeed here.
No question.
Well, thanks everybody for watching. Thanks for your comments. Thanks for your support. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining me today. And thanks for our producers in the back that make this all happen. If you want to know more about what we do here at Insight, visit us at insight.com, and we'll see you next time at Insight Live.
Thanks, everyone.